And now, a passage from Grandfather's Tales of North Carolina History. The Stamp Party in Wilmington. No braver soldier ever yet drew sword. Through the whole history of North Carolina, the Cape Fear section has been the fruitful nursery of heroes, patriots, and statesmen. Wilmington is its business center, and Wilmington has always been the home of men who were foremost in the race of distinction. On the roll of her great names, the Ashes, the Waddells, the Swans, the Moores, the Hoopers, the Howes, and the Hills are familiar to all who feel a just pride in the good name of North Carolina. Among all these illustrious names, there is no one more distinguished than General John Ashe. He was the son of John Baptista Ashe, the founder of this distinguished family in North Carolina. He had for some years been a leading member of the Colonial Assembly, and in 1762 was chosen Speaker of that body. He soon became the most prominent man in the colony, and by his position was the most influential. He was entitled to the unique distinction of having been the harbinger of the Revolution in North Carolina, and probably in America, the first to resist the authority of Great Britain, the first to defy it by an overt act, the first to triumph over its officers, and the first to compel royal officials to sign an act of disobedience to the sovereign authority of England's king. This bold act was done in open day, in the presence of the governor backed with a royal force, and has no parallel in the history of these trying times of the Stamp Act troubles. It was a controversy over the old question of taxation without representation that roused the resistance of our revolutionary fathers 10 years later, and the matter of contention was the same: the imposition of a tax stamp on paper. The heroic act was thus: Houston was the stamp master of the British government, an official representative of the government who was to have the custody of the stamped paper used for official purposes and distribute it for use among the people. There was a tax on the paper, not onerous, but offensive to the American people because it was a tax that they had no voice in its enactment. A large quantity of this paper was expected every day to arrive and be handed over to the stamp master. About the middle of November 1765, Houston came to Wilmington, and Colonel Ashe led the people with drums beating and colors flying to his lodgings, and took him out and carried him to the courthouse, where he was forced to sign a resignation of his office. A few days later the stamps arrived in the sloop of war Diligence, but as there was now no stamp master to receive them, they remained boxed up on board that ship. 2 months later, 2 merchant vessels coming into port were seized by the sloop of war Viper, commanded by Captain Lobb, because their papers were not stamped, and they were held by the war vessels off Old Brunswick, where Governor Tryon had his residence, and where the ships of war lay at anchor. Colonel Ashe, as Speaker of the House of Commons, had warned Governor Tryon that any attempt to enforce the Stamp Act would be resisted to death. The release of the captured vessels was at once demanded. Governor Tryon, after some delay, refused to release them. In the meantime, Ashe and his associates had perfected their plans. He called out the militia of New Hanover, and being joined by Colonel Waddell and the Brunswick militia and detachments from Bladen and Duplin, he marched to Old Brunswick, determined to put an end to that act of Parliament in this province. Arriving at the governor's mansion on the evening of the 19th of February, they informed Governor Tryon that they had come to redress their grievances and demanded to see Captain Lobb. But Captain Lobb was not there. A detachment then pushed on to Fort Johnson at Smithville to seize the fort and get possession of the cannon. But Lobb was able to spike the guns before the fort was taken. At noon the next day, the governor and Captain Lobb and the king's officers held a council on board the ship of war Diligence, and Captain Lobb declared his determination never to surrender the captured merchant ships. 2 hours later, Ashe and a band of patriots boarded the Diligence, and there, under the royal flag, surrounded by the king's forces, they demanded that Captain Lobb should give up the vessels and abandon his purpose to enforce the Stamp Act. Their blood was up, and they were resolved to fight to the death. Their undaunted spirit brooked no opposition. Lobb was compelled to yield. Within 3 hours after the agreement was made in the Council of King's officers to hold the captured vessels, the British commander surrendered them up into the hands of the patriot leaders. But that was not enough. Ashe and the people had come with arms in their hands to put an end to the Stamp Act, and the work was not yet finished. They now proposed to make the Crown officers swear never to issue any stamp paper in this colony. The first officer they demanded was Colonel Pennington, His Majesty's Comptroller of Customs. Pennington was then in the governor's mansion, and Tryon sought to protect him. But the mansion was thoroughly surrounded by armed and determined men, and every avenue of escape was cut off. Pennington resigned his office to the governor and surrendered himself and took the oath the patriots dictated. And so also Mr. Day, the collector of the port, and all the county clerks and other crown officers were required to swear never to issue or to use any stamp paper in the province. This heroic act was revolutionary seed that sprouted 10 years later, and for 7 years produced through blood and suffering the glorious fruit of independence. If you enjoy the content of High Americana, please consider supporting the channel, donating to Patreon linked below. Thank you very much.